You mentioned that he was doing much better right now. What's his overall condition?
Well, he's still in critical condition, but I would say he's in substantially better condition than he was even 2 days ago, and that, in turn, is better condition than when he came in the door.
And when people mention what happened at the scene and his transportation, they say he was awake at the scene, he was coherent, talking to people. By the time he got in the ambulance and transported, he was in shock. What caused that to change?
Well, the way it works is that when you get shot and you start to bleed, initially, you still have enough blood flow to your brain so that you can be awake and talk. Now, eventually, the bleeding continues. Often the bleeding accelerates, and you get to a point where your blood pressure falls and the blood flow to your brain becomes insufficient for you to be conscious. And at that point, you pass out. Now, if this keeps going without care, usually surgical care, that often ends up to be lethal.
So it's not uncommon for somebody to be awake and then a few minutes later to be in shock and unconscious?
No, to be instantly unconscious, usually you're talking about a gunshot wound to the head. Now on TV, sometimes you see people are shot in the arm and they fall down cold, unconscious. That's not quite as common in the real world.
On the scene, there were people helping out. With him in particular, they were applying direct pressure to the pelvis region. It's hard to stop bleeding in that area, but these interventions, were they life-saving?
Oh, I think they were in this case. Now, you're absolutely right. In some cases, all of the bleeding in a pelvic injury is internal, but in this case, there was a substantial component of external bleeding. So that direct pressure from the outside is actually a big part of what we were doing here in the first minutes. So I think it was especially critical in this case. Now, as you know, applying direct pressure to wounds has become a topic of national importance now that we're seeing more mass shooting events. The Department of Homeland Security and the American College of Surgeons have come together on a program to try to get first responders and the public to do just what was done here, which is holding direct pressure. So I think that it made a big difference in this case.
My experiences with military medicine, and in military medicine, a lot of these techniques were established because of what happened during the last few wars, where we learned on the battlefield how to take care of soldiers, how to save their lives. Did that happen here? Are you using lessons that were learned in the wars to save Congressman Scalise's life?
Oh yeah, we're absolutely. As you're implying, a lot of the major advances in trauma care, unfortunately, come from conflict. So there are a number of things that were used in this case that directly arose from lessons learned. One of those would be the concept of stage surgery, which has been perfected really in the in the last decade of war. And the idea there is that the first operation is not the big operation where everything gets tidied up. You try to basically prevent death in the first operation, and then you stage out the other things that need to be done. Other things that have come out of the war include what's called damage control resuscitation, and that has to do with picking the right amounts and timing of the blood products that you give to people. So yeah, a lot of this does come out of of conflict in the military.
And you mentioned the stage operations to control bleeding and then subsequently do the other operations that need to be done. Used to be years ago they would try to do it all at once in one big operation. Why the change?
Well, I think the reason the phrase was chosen, I believe it arises from an episode in the Navy when people realized that when a ship was hit, it was easy to spend a lot of time trying to fix the whole thing up and then to discover that you're underwater and that you've missed the opportunity maybe to do one thing and keep the ship afloat. So what does that mean in trauma? It means that when you're shot full of holes and a bunch of things are injured, as a surgeon, I think that needs to be fixed, that needs to be fixed, that needs to be fixed. And if I don't do all that, I'm not doing enough. So that's the kind of traditional mindset. The damage control mindset is that if you do all that, you might win all those battles, but you're going to lose the war, and the patient's going to die on the table in the first case. So the damage control philosophy entails using a relatively brief first operation to largely control hemorrhage. There's a few other priorities. You don't want things that are spilling to be continuing to spill, but mainly it's about preventing death and coming back later to do the other things you need to do.
And in cases like that, the bleeding is everything. You need to stop that bleeding.
Yeah, the bleeding is usually it's the sort of biggest tiger in the grass for the first day. we often say, and I know you as an ER physician think of this the same way, that airway and breathing sort of kills you in seconds, but once you nail that down and fix that, it's, the next day is usually about trying not to die from bleeding.
Now, when Congressman Scalise first came here, and you guys first got in there and started taking care of him, how concerned were you about his life at that point?
Well, I actually was not there. My partners, Dr. Trankium and Dr. Shiflett, were there. They've done this stuff a million times. It's not hard to know for somebody who's done a bunch of it, and you would be the same way. It's not hard to see that when somebody's got a transpelvic gunshot wound and they're in shock, that they need to get to the operating room. So because of their years of experience, that's a bit of a no-brainer to them. And
you mentioned during the press conference, but I'll ask the question again, when people think about somebody getting shot in the hip, they think, okay, it's a bone, not that big of a deal, it's going to hurt and there's going to take repairing, but it's not that big of a deal. But in his case, it was a rifle wound through the pelvis. Why is that different? Well, first of all, I think that people who have dealt with a lot of gunshot wounds, either in medicine or in being on a battlefield and seeing them, I don't think many of those people are thinking in the way that you just described, but perhaps they are. There's a couple important distinctions. If you just think anatomically, a bullet that goes from front to back through a hip area is probably mainly going to involve bones. Certainly there's arteries in the area, but there's a potential there for it to be a relatively, mild to moderate situation. Now, the reason that this phrase transpelvic exists is to describe the situation where it basically goes right to left. And there, you're traversing a whole bunch of not only critical organs, but a whole bunch of really big blood vessels. And what are the big organs and blood vessels? What's the most concerning in that area if a bullet goes through there? Well, again, the early concern is not for organs, but for blood vessels. And in the middle of the abdomen, you have the aorta, which carries all the blood down from your heart, and that splits into other big arteries called the iliac arteries, and those live in the pelvis, and they all branch into smaller arteries. And then on the return side, there's a number of small veins, and so both the arteries and the veins can cause really horrific bleeding. And both in the military and in emergency medicine, we always talk about the golden hour, how important it is to get things controlled in that golden hour, because that's going to keep them alive. Was that this case? Well, I think that we talk about the golden hour as if it, as if it's an exact time. It's not really quite true. There's a big element of the sooner the better when it comes to controlling bleeding. The pace of bleeding in an injury like this is rapid enough that you really don't have a lot of time to control bleeding. Certainly, it would be lethal within a couple hours, if not less. So you're talking minutes, not hours or days, that this needs to be controlled. Yeah. The other thing is, as the bullets, this is a rifle bullet. This is a high-velocity rifle bullet going through. So it's not just the metal going through that's causing issues. Right. What else is causing problems? Well, there's a couple ways that bullets cause harm, one of which is simply the metal bullet traveling through and lacerating things. But there's other things in play, too. Most bullets, either by accident or more commonly by design, will either distort themselves into a bigger thing that injures tissue, or they'll fragment into pieces, and then those pieces go and injure a bunch of different things. So that's one thing that happens. The other thing that happens is that there's a blast effect. So there's there's not just the actual path of the fragments in the bullet, but around that there's a path of destruction from the blast wave that comes from the projectile. And both those are critical. Yeah. Where do you go from here with him, with Congressman Scalise? Well, again, we're in this staged surgery pathway. So we have more operations, and I've sort of decided we're not going to get into the details of those. Okay. But we have more operations to do to close that out. And then there's more orthopedic bone operations that need to be done as well. And this is the same stage type surgeries that anybody with this type of wound would go through? Yeah. Right. Yeah, this is typical for an injury pattern and for the degree of what we call hemorrhagic shock that he had when he came in.
Hey, NBC News fans, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here, and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.